a founding member of our Center for Disease Modeling, is a member of our National COVID-19 Mathematic Rapid Response Task Force. Um, I have been working with Jacques actually for many years since the SARS. We have gone through three major pandemic using our limited mathematical technologies to assess pandemic management of both SARS and then pandemic and the COVID-19 now. So we've been seeing mathematics in action and disease pandemic outbreak in action. But I think Jacques today is going to show you disease outbreak in the film. So with pleasure, Jacques, it's your time.
Okay, so I should share my screen. Okay, so is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Yes, very well.
Okay, so what I would like to do today is present some a lighter approach to modeling of infectious disease than is the norm in this series of seminars. So basically it's a look at movies from a mathematical modeler's perspective, and so the approach is really the look that I take in interpreting some of these movies. So why do we do that? Well, for entertainment purposes, and in fact there will be some science towards the end, but the bulk of the talk is not so much science as how can we see some redeeming values in entertainment products or entertainment / artistic endeavors, in particular feature films. So as you know, one of the ways that risks is assessed in France is by having colored regions following traffic light signs convention. So green regions are good, light is cautious, and red is bad. And in fact, this scheme has been imported, adopted by the Quebec government. Last week, they announced that they would use a regional assessment of risk based on the same method that France is using, at least conceptually. It's very unclear exactly how the details will work out and the extent to which it will be aligned along the criteria that France has been using. So in this spirit, since this is an unusual topic in this presentation, my aim will be to avoid the red region defined by this intermediate region where the knowledge of a topic is in a dangerous zone where one can make embarrassing statements. One of the usefulness of looking at movies is to see an illustration of some of the features that we see in disease propagation and the means of intervention to prevent propagation. So there can be illustration of the characteristic of the disease, and of course, being works of fiction, the possibilities are not limited by biological reality or physical reality. And so propagation by airborne transmission, more or less physical contact, so biting or just physical touching, or even in some instances, psychic links. As I said, we're not limited by physical reality. And possible interventions. And there are a number of instances that I will point out where the limits and the drawbacks in some of these interventions can degenerate either non-pharmaceutical intervention like this social distancing or quarantine establishment and development of vaccine, antiviral medications, or the removal of infected individuals. And so truth is said to be stranger than fiction, but sometimes fiction get entangled with truth. And one illustration is an incident that occurred at the Montreal Casino a number of years ago, where someone won $600,000 playing Keno. So Keno is a game at the casino where 60 out of 60 numbers, so numbers 1 to 60, are drawn at random. So 20 of the 60 are picked up, are drawn at random, and the player has to guess which numbers will come out of this draw. And one individual actually succeeded in picking 19 of the 20 numbers 3 times in a row. So he was extremely lucky, and the casino owners were sufficiently suspicious that they did not believe this was pure luck. And in fact, this individual explained that he was using a computer system to find the pattern, and this system was based on the results of the mathematician Ian Malcolm from chaos theory. So I'm a specialist in chaos theory, and I never heard of Ian Malcolm as a mathematician. In fact, I had heard of Ian Malcolm. This is Ian Malcolm, and if you think this is an actor, well, that's because Ian Malcolm is the mathematician in Jurassic Park, in Michael Crichton's movie and book originally. And Ian Malcolm, in fact, is a composite, according to Crichton, of a number of real mathematicians. So here's an example where fiction creeped in reality in a very not so obvious way if one was not an expert in this theory. So the current pandemic has sort of been foreseen before. So here's the title page from Time magazine from 2017. Quebec Science in November of last year basically said, yeah, we are ready because there are governmental agencies that are looking at pandemics. And of course, there's a user's guide, what everyone should know. And really one of the things we're trying to determine is what the world would be like after the pandemic. Well, some people have a dark sense of humor. So in the early days of the pandemic, a shop owner in Belgium used the fact that one Belgian beer is called sudden death, mort subite. So he had this promotion where for every two, of course, there were all sorts of jokes on the Corona beer and the coronavirus. So for every 2 Corona that you would buy, you would get 1 free sudden death. So this sale lasted about half a day, just the time for the brewery to hear about it and shut it down. So why should we be looking at movies during the pandemic? Well, looking at movies is good for you. It makes you psychologically resilient. That's a serious study. It's a survey from a number of individuals, and in fact, the survey leads to data. And so, depending on how many movies you've seen, if you've seen many, several, 1 or 2, or never seen them, then your preparedness for the pandemic will be decreasing. as a function of how many movies you've seen. And so I guess I'm somewhere around there. So I should be well prepared, as you will probably be convinced at the end of this presentation. In fact, there's also foreseen pandemic in the cartoon Asterix, which is a French comic strip. In 2017, there was one book with a race driver who's called coronavirus in many languages except German. And what's interesting about coronavirus is that his help is called bacillus. So what I will be presenting are some serious studies, not so serious, and then some mathematics towards the end in a particular context of incidents occurring in movies. Of course, historically, the use of mathematics for mainly pedagogical purposes has been to look at mathematical modeling of zombies as promoted by Robert Smith from the University of Ottawa. And in this case, what you're doing is looking at zombies as a stage before being removed. So it's looking at zombieism as a disease. So you caught the virus and you become a zombie. So it is a new stage of infection. And you can set up models of a similar form as a traditional SIR model of McCormick and Kermick. And you can try to quarantine and look at the immediate stages of infection before becoming a full-grown zombie. So you can do the refinement and different formulations of the zombie as an infectious disease, as you would do in, one can say, more traditional diseases. But whatever you do, the zombies always win. So they always take out the full population. It's just a matter of time. You can literally, you can run, but you cannot hide from the zombies. Eventually they will win. And so this has been used, in fact, by biologists as a teaching tool to show what happens and what the different parameters, the roles the different parameters can play in the modeling equation for these infectious diseases. And they have a full working website where you can do your own simulation, change the infection rate, change the intensity of the disease, different levels of populations. And so, as I said, you can shape these models as traditional compartmental models. Well, in addition to mathematicians introducing zombies for pedagogical purposes, in fact, in the humanities and social sciences, zombies and vampires have been object of interest. So here's a colleague of mine in the literature department and trained in 19th century literature, who's interested in vampires in film and literature. So his interest is looking at, of course, the granddaddy of all vampires work, Dracula's, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and all the way to more contemporary work, and very contemporary work, looking at vampire as a focus for textual analysis and all sorts of issues, race, disease, social class, and death. So social class and the role that aristocrats, for example, were playing in Victorian England. And what do they do in this class? Well, they have to read books and look at films. And they do literary analysis, and comparative literature studies are done. And this is a real scholar field with film studies on epidemic disease and television, for example. And these are also used to look at management of risk and the ways in which people can react to fictional work. So, and as is stated here in this study, from risk management journal, fictional media play a role in collective and individual management of risk emotion. And it can also build the vision that people can have of epidemiologists and scientists in general. So this is a significant field of investigation, how are scientists represented in film and literature. And as I said, the cinema in general and zombie cinema in particular reflects social construction of risk, anxiety, and disease pandemic, all the way to linguistic studies where some of the terms used are lost in translation when you go from English to Spanish. In fact, there's a whole zombie theory that takes the form of full textbooks, different aspects, and many of them are connected to the current sociological and political environment. And I'll come back to this theme later on. So different people have looked at the representation, and the authors I've cited so far are more from the humanities and social sciences, cultural studies. Some medically trained people have also looked at disease in cinema, so their point of view is a more technical one, and they tend to have a critical view of the scientific accuracy. But one thing you must understand is that being concerned about the scientific accuracy is maybe not the proper framework of analysis, since this comment they make is about the movie Resident Evil, which has limited connection with reality. This movie being based, in fact, on a video game of a few years back. So, as I mentioned, one of the features of many of the movies is the way they represent social concerns and the representation of sociological analysis. So in the movie Train to Busan, this author claims you can make an analysis of looking at economic inequalities. So what happens when the very rich suddenly become the target of people who are well off economically. And as I mentioned, the public health literacy, that is the perception of different disease and the way they are addressed, and particularly the way epidemiologists and scientists are represented, and modelers in some instances, it's shaped to some extent by what's being presented in feature films, especially very commercially successful films with the large audiences. And so this author has made a summary of some viral outbreak films, some of which I'll come back to later. And so some of the issues that are really related to perception and literacy are concerned with things such as conspiracies, um, the way the viral uh, agent, so many times it's a viral disease, violation of preventive measures, the character of epidemiologists, whether it's very prominent or not, and whether there's a conspiracy. So is the disease due to action of fringe groups or in fact the CDC or the UK government, big pharma? So the usual suspects in social media conspiracy networks, and whether preventive measures are taken. So PPEs, which we've heard about quite a bit in this pandemics, are prominent in many of these movies, and whether this is intentional release of the virus. So is it a naturally occurring one or something that is induced by the action of some fringe groups or, as I mentioned, some government agencies? So quite a range of possibilities, and some are more forcefully depicted in the movies. And so the role of media in medical humanities is described as in this movie as a scholarly interest in the role of mainstream news media, and experts in risk communication can strategically plan for media involvement. So news and popular culture is depicted in this, is studied in this journal article. Another one from Emerging Infectious Diseases, Our Social Response is depicted in cinema, and here they make a detailed study of two movies, one of which I'll come back to later. And as I mentioned, suspicious of authorities, distrust during the pandemic crisis is a non-trivial task, and I'll come back to that in discussing contagion. So in determining which movies do describe infectious diseases, it turns out that during this pandemic, a number of lists have appeared, and here's someone who was doing a doctoral thesis on loneliness in film and television and the community building functions of TV series, who pointed out some of the possibilities of looking at these movies and the extent to which these movies were reflecting reality. Before the pandemic, as a holiday project, so this foundation suggested a number of viewing diseases on the big screen. And ever since the pandemics, of course, a number of suggestions have appeared. So here we have outbreaks and pandemics to watch. The best pandemics and virus movies: Stay Home, Lock the Door, movies that people are watching, people you should be watching, and up to 79 of these movies you should be watching, and a selection of the good ones, and new ones that you should be looking, and of course some that you should not be looking at. Another list of some that you should not be looking at, and some of them were really significantly destroyed by critic when they were released. So Cassandra Crossing is one of them, doomed by silly premise and miscasting. And during the pandemics, in fact, in April of this year, there was this montage of previous movies that was released as Corona Zombies, and this is number one of the movies you should not be looking at. And of course, now with some more perspective on why are people interested, especially at this time that contagion movies feel different. So let me now look at a number of these movies and the historical context that I mentioned before. So one class of movies is dealing with historical events, and one of which is the plague from the Middle Ages in England. So there's a classical movie by Ingmar Bergman from the late 50s called The Seventh Seal, which is not obvious from this poster, but is from this one, which is basically a crusader coming back and having to deal with that in a dialogue form. Another one is called Black Death, which is also concerned with crusaders. And in this case, it's mainly a group of Englishmen on a mission. And the movie revolves around a village that's isolated, where no instances of plague have occurred. And there are rumors of witchcraft, and they are sent by a bishop to investigate and get rid of the witch. And some of the things they discuss during this, along the movie, is where does the pestilence come from? Well, this being an English movie, it is said to originate from France, where all foul things emerge. And one of the interesting plot point of the movie is that they end up concluding that the village was not protected by the witch, they were simply remote. So this is an instance of isolation, which was protecting the village, because once the pestilence crossed their march, it killed them too. Once again, the historical context, making things relevant. In the late 40s, there was an incident of smallpox in New York City. And so two movies came out a few years later. One was called Panic in the Streets and sold as the screen excitement of the year. Well, this was released in December of 1950, so the excitement was at the end of the year. And there was another one called The Killer That Stalked New York. And this one gives the atmosphere of the film noir of the period, and has a number of interesting features.
On a November day in 1947, without either gun or knife, one person was able to bring terror to the hearts of 8 million people.
What was she doing in Cuba?
Smuggling diamonds into the States.
No quarantine restrictions between Cuba and the continental United States.
We've been looking everywhere for you.
I need medicine. Stay back.
We need your help, Sheila.
Keep away from me.
Sheila.
I came here to kill you. For what you did to me, to Francie.
I'll help you back, Sheila. You can trust me.
Stay back! Stay where you are!
So this movie is centered around the smallpox carrier, and you see the notion of Cuba coming in, and some of the issues from the late 50s. So political uncertainty also led to a number of features that related to man-made apocalypse and bioterrorism. And one series, in fact, was based on the book I Am Legend, where vampires occurred. And this has led to 3 movies, in fact. One from the 60s with Vincent Price called The Last Man on Earth, which is in fact the closest to the book. One from the early 70s called The Omega Man, which was in fact redone with I Am Legend by Will Smith in the early 10s. And in fact, my interest in trying to gather movies and pandemics and infectious diseases was in part induced by one incident in the early days of the lockdown, when someone was walking his dog when the lockdown was in force, and in the particular area where this person was, only essential endeavors were allowed for coming out, and he was intercepted by a policeman who told him that this is not I Am Legend, you are not Bill Smith, and you should not be walking your dog. Another feature which is concerned with government conspiracies is the Andromeda strain, which describes the apparition of a viral infection, and the whole plot is to determine what the virus is and how to counteract it. And in fact, this movie is based on a book by Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, and another book of Michael Crichton is quoted in a supposedly serious study on red blood cell dynamics, where the sequel to Jurassic Park, in fact, The Lost World, is in the references. And in this case, this paper is concerned about production and destruction of red blood cells and different mechanisms. And you can make an analogy with these destruction and production mechanisms with the behavior of feeding behavior, with the behavior of feeding of some different species. And you can make an argument, in fact, that from the description of course, the fictional behavior of different dinosaur species, that T-Rex are better parents than velociraptors because they do not overfeed their children, and they have a more ecological approach to waste of food. So Cassandra Crossing, which as I've mentioned before, there's a more recent version of Pandemics in the Train, called Train to Busan, which I've alluded to before. And this one, as I mentioned, is concerned about sociological study of different of people with different economic means. And a recent one is flu, also from South Korea, and this one is concerned with, as its name implies, the spread of the flu in the city in South Korea. And in this case, it's one of the first instances where the effect of quarantine are very heavily depicted. And if I can try to show.
시민들의 불안 심리를 잠재우기는 쉽지 않아 보입니다.
모든 병원에서 유사 환자가 접수됐답니다.
홍방가지의 특징입니다. 사망한 주병의 증상과 완전히 일치합니다.
사망자 수는 기하급수적으로 늘어날 것으로 예상됩니다.
당장 폐쇄해야 합니다.
And will be segregated at the camp.
감염자들이잖아. 다 쏴죽일게.
Simply cannot afford to let it.
이건 어쩔 수 없는 선택입니다.
우리 미리 잠시만 맡아주세요.
한시간에 2,000명씩 죽어나간다.
엄마 여기 있어? 엄마 여기 왜 있냐고. 정말 여기가 어디라고.
치료제가 쓰고 없어요. 같이 살려고 그러는 거야. 당신 혼자만 살려고 하는 거잖아. 애식은 엄마한테 데려다 줄게.
저는 지금 꼭 안으로 들어가야 됩니다.
So in this case, the disease is reputed to be 100% fatal, and the whole discussion of the movie, the plot really revolves around the quarantine and how to deal with this isolation and how people will resist. And as I mentioned before, many of the plot elements revolve around the extent to which people respect government directives. So many movies on post-apocalypse, 28 days later, 28 weeks later, the sequel, an outbreak, which was quite successful in the mid-90s and does represent a number of the issues on control of diseases. And one of the interesting aspects is the way the spread of the disease is presented to the authorities.
The most optimistic projection for the spread of the virus is this: 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours.
The greatest medical crisis of all time.
We can't stop it.
Begins.
So notice in this case how the disease stops at the Canadian border. So in this case, it's one of those instances where social media, at least in this case, is from the early 10s, is described as one of the counteracting agent in government interventions. And there's a quote from the movie that in order to become sick, you have to come in contact with a certain person or something they touch, so the usual means of propagation. But to get scared, all they have to do is to come in contact with a rumor. So social media is far more dangerous than the disease. And other movies have revolved around loss of biological function, loss of sight, loss of the different senses, loss of fertility, and gathering fear and paralysis and inducing people to kill themselves. So I mentioned in the abstract that I would have a Canadian component. Well, the Canadian components really comes from David Cronenberg, whose first feature film was Shivers, which was actually set in Montreal, and Rabid a few years later, which has also been remade last year by Canadian producers with Canadian actors. And Pontypool is an unusual movie on infectious diseases, because in this case the infection is language based, so words are the means of propagation of the virus, and it only works in English. And so people get stuck on words, become scrambled, and then they want to get rid of the disease. And this is also labeled as Cronenbergian by movie critics. And finally, some mathematics in the last 2 or 3 minutes. So in many instances, the outcome of an epidemic is the global destruction of an infection starting from a super spreader or super controller, so either a king or a queen. And there's a scene in Game of Thrones, and also one in The Great Wall, a full-length movie. So that's the, so if I try to scenes in The Great Wall. So what happens in the Great Wall is a catastrophic destruction of the infected individual. So you can relate that to what's called a boundary crisis in dynamical systems. So a boundary crisis occurs, as in the quadratic map, when the attractor suddenly disappears. And this occurs for period 3 orbits and the invariant interval at the end of the sequence of period doubling bifurcation and chaotic dynamics. And this has also been observed in a 3-species food chain with equations. So you have a logistic equation and some hierarchical food chain. 3-dimensional attractor, 2-dimensional Poincare section, and the quadratic map, and boundary crisis in this tripartite food chain having a bifurcation diagram of the same form. So one interpretation that can be made of these collapsing invasive species is the existence of a boundary crisis. So in conclusion, a film can be an illustration of the different means of propagation, airborne or physical contact, possible interventions. Our vaccine are accepted, our quarantine is respected, And what's the connection with COVID-19? Well, COVID is a marathon, not a sprint. Well, there's also a movie on marathon, and some of us know what a marathon is. And I will end by thanking the funding agencies, and particularly the Mathematics COVID-19 Task Force. And I will end, but after seeing Pony Pool, I should call that fin. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jacques. So we also allow now audience to raising hand, ask the questions, and we will unmute you, so you can ask the question directly. And before that, I would like to ask Jacques a light question: how many movies did you watch during this pandemic? Did you watch all of this?
A few dozens. No, some of them I had seen already, but I did discover a few. I would say about 10 to 15 that I was not aware of.
Thank you. One of the interesting part in the film is about the rumor spread. Really, the connection.
Yeah,
really
yes,
how the rumor spread of the rumor is complicating. The epidemic control.
Yes, this is one of the recurring themes, even if in the most down-to-earth ones, like the killer that struck New York. There's also a concern about panic. In fact, the other analogous one is panic in the streets.
Right.
So how are government interventions perceived, and the extent to which quarantine or others will be respected. So in many instances, the army is deployed, and this is particularly obvious in outbreak. And so it's not inconsequential and not so far from reality to I mean, limited extent, of course. And more recently, this notion of social media is quite present. And in more recent movies, people have cell phones, and one of the things that becomes important is the way in which the communication infrastructure is preserved or not. So it's not, I mean, it's, you should not take these movies as a blueprint, but there's some instances, as I mentioned, which are relevant, I think, to understand some of the, or at least explore some of the possibilities of people behaving.
I have a chart from, so I think Mark Souza. Mark, you want to ask the question directly, or we can unmute you, or you can ask the question directly.
Okay, I can read. Aware of
Max.
Yeah. So Max Souza asks me if I'm aware of epidemic model where the boundary crisis occur. No. This came to me looking at these movies. I was trying to imagine which mechanism would produce this collapse of the whole population. So boundary crisis seems to be a possible mechanism.
So maybe a relevant question with Mark's question is, what kind of epidemiological system will behave like the food chain of species?
My notion was that the queen or the king in these cases should be the anti-super spreader. You know, with the core and the super spreader, if you control them, you control pretty much the population. But in this case, it would be like minus the super spreader. So if you kill the disease from the origin.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, one of the pretty much systemic simplification that occurs in the movies is the time frame. So the incubation period is quite limited, especially in zombie movies. Vampire movies are a bit more subtle, where there's always a few days where you can save the person in most instances, but zombies is, so that's probably the less realistic one, the absence of incubation period. Right. And so this is one of the point that is picked up by most medical people looking at movies, the incubation period.
And again, you have this asymptomatic infection, asymptomatic infection.
Yes, yes.
And super spreader, that will be a natural food chain down there. You will be through different levels. Other questions, comments? Are you interested in editing a movie, directing a movie? Actually, it would be very interesting to see a document of how the projection and the epidemic control and public behavior changes during this process. And
yeah, what's the influence of fiction on people's behavior? Right. And perception? Because I was really I was surprised when the casino incident occurred, and this guy quoted Ian Malcolm as a chaos theory mathematician. So in his mind, it was fiction as truth. So the extent to which people get so much influence, and when you look at some media outlet, it's not always obvious whether something is a documentary or a work of fiction. Of course, with zombies and movies like The Great Wall, there's no ambiguity, but sometimes it's subtler. So I would not be surprised that people will be influenced by works of fiction, which are realistic as far as realism is possible in these works.
Okay, other questions, comments? And I'm very glad to see our colleague from the Fields Institute and the deputy director has been with us, and she just left a second ago. And if no questions, I just want to, again, on behalf of Fields Institute, on behalf of Kuma, and want to thank Jacques for the presentation today, but also for your contribution to the task force. And it's a task force still in action, so we're looking forward to interact with you, and we're looking forward to future presentations. So
yeah, I can do mathematics also.
Right, both. Yeah, so it's very interesting to have some mentioning of Robert Smith's work, for example. And you mentioned actually there is if the media is trying to film a document about this. So I'm sure you know about that, and I understand you spoke to them. But again, I think it's important that we find a way to communicate as well our message to the public using language that can be actually reflect the science, but also understandable by the public.
Yes, very much so.
So with that, I want to thank you again, Jacques, and that will conclude the today's seminar. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.